Memories of my father. My father was a Republican, but he was very liberal in his actions. He hated Roosevelt because he thought Social Security was a really socialist idea. He thought that was outrageous. But my parents' best friends were, I'm not going to name names, but a homosexual male couple, an asexual male, and two Japanese American brother and sister. And this was right after the Second World War. So he was very liberal in his actions.
Mother, why is that significant? Remember, we all have gay friends now, but 2 generations
That was
ago,
very, very rare then. I mean, nobody. It was just unheard of then.
and so that's relevant. Why did that impact you? What did it teach you that those were his chosen
Well,
friends?
as with my husband, it taught me compassion for people and understanding and acceptance of people for who they are. We have a couple funny stories about my father. My mother and I would be, say, in the kitchen, and my father would go out, and we both would say, he's going to come back. And sure enough, he would come back in again because he forgot something and then go out again. But he did it all the time. Oh, my father was very difficult in many ways. If he couldn't find something, he would get very angry and very upset. And one time he said, nobody's leaving this house until I find this. He wanted us to all go out looking for it. He was tough. When he was a young man, he would sing, I guess it must have been vaudeville, and he was singing on the road. He loved to sing. He had a wonderful singing voice. And his father needed him, because my father was a civil engineer, and my grandfather had a construction company, and he wanted my father to come home. So my father came home, being a very obedient son, and ran the company for his father. Oh, I know, his father was going to Europe. And while my grandfather was in Europe, the economy collapsed, the market collapsed in 29. And my father was left with that tremendous responsibility. And I think responsibility weighed heavy on him, but he always rose to the occasion. When he had a construction company, his brothers were less than diligent, and it was a heavy responsibility for my father to be responsible for them. My father was very frugal and very much aware of money and saving money. I think he was worried about my mother being secure when he died. My mother always wanted to move, and we would go out looking at houses, and she would find a house, and he wouldn't move. He would not spend the money to move out of South Philadelphia. He just didn't. He wanted to have money and not things.
And this is the house that we all would
And this is the
spend
house on
Thanksgiving-
13th Street, yeah, where we lived.
And spent many Thanksgivings together, grandmoms.
Oh, grandmothers, yeah,
Right.
yeah.
Tell me about this. Fondest
Well, one of the
memories.
funny memory I have, my father was very smart, and I guess it's a male trait, but he was oblivious. And my mother and I were sitting on the porch in Wildwood Crest, waiting for my father to come down, and we watched as he drove right past us. He turned around and came back. Oh, I remember rushing. Oh, he wanted us so badly to see the sunset in Cape May. And we would go we would get dinner fast, and we would go out, and we'd get there, and we'd always miss it. Finally, one day we got there in time to see the sun go down in Cape May, the sunset in Cape May. Oh, he was so funny. He lost his gold cufflinks, and he couldn't find them anywhere. And he was sure somebody stole them. And then I think weeks later, he found them in a sock, tied in a sock.
Well, your father was an alpha male, and that's how we know Uncle Larry. So having two strong-willed firstborn males, was there any conflict?
My recollection was that my father was very hard on Larry, and I remember hearing that he never went to anything that like Larry's graduation. He didn't do the things that parents do. I don't know why. And if Larry wasn't perfect, it really upset my father. And subsequently, there was I guess a tension between them, because I think Larry was frustrated that my father wasn't more accepting. And my father was, I don't know, because usually things like that date back to my father's childhood. And my father's father, he was the oldest son, and that was a god then. But my father had 5 brothers and 2 sisters. And then when my father took over, my grandfather died, my father took over the business. It was a heavy responsibility for him. Now, I don't know how that would reflect on his fathering, because his father, well, I don't know what my grandfather did wrong that my father felt that way about my brother. I guess my parents were together, and I guess it was the time before I was married. It was before I was married. And Larry and Georgie were married. Of course, Lydia was 10 years younger than I, so she was in her teens. And he found this beautiful negligee set. So he bought 3 of them. And of course, I never wear it. Georgiana never wear it. But the interesting thing about that negligee set is when my mother's good friend Marion Fumara died, her son asked my mother to buy a negligee set for her to be buried in. And I said, wait, I've got the perfect set. And it was gorgeous. It was a pale green and it had white lace on it. It was really beautiful. And she was buried in that. Now, that was a nice story, yeah.
What would you want your grandchildren to know about your father, Boom Pom?
He was a very good man. He was a very moral man. He was compassionate. He was very intelligent and hardworking. He went to Drexel. He was an engineer. He obeyed his father, even though it was against his wishes or what my father wanted to do. He loved his children and he loved his grandchildren.
What do you think he would want to say to his grandchildren, if the ones he didn't know?
He would adore them. He wouldn't say anything. He would just love them to pieces. He would have been crazy about them. Even when he did know Jeffrey and Cynthia. I guess he must have known Lawrence too. And Larry was 3. Larry was 3 years old when he died. No. That was horrible. It was a phone call in the night. And he had had angina, and this was before bypass. His father died at 63. My father died at 63, and my father's brother died at 63. And then they invented bypasses, and my other uncles had bypasses and lived much longer. It was a shame.
Strong statement for medical science.
Oh my gosh, yes, amazing what medical science can do now. My mother was extremely intelligent. She graduated from high school at 16, and then it was unheard of for a girl to go to college then. That would have been, in the 30s. So she went to work as a secretary. Going back a little bit, I don't know if anybody wants to talk about my grandmother was widowed at 45, and she had 8 children, and they lived in Hershey. And her oldest son, my Uncle Romeo, was a pharmacist. My Aunt Eva had graduated from high school, and she was a secretary, and they supported the family. And it was very different then, because my Uncle Edward went to Lehigh, and I don't know how they paid for it. I guess it was a whole different situation then. And my mother was the 6th of 7 children. She had a little sister who died, and it was very often in that generation to lose a child. My grandma Macchione also lost a child, a little girl. Oh, I have memories of when Larry and Richard were 19 months apart. And I would call my mother, if both of them got sick, there's no way I could have handled 2 sick babies. And I would call her and she would come over and we'd each take a child. Also, my husband loved to go out singing on Friday nights. And my mother would come with us and we would go to Deptford Mall and we would go to dinner. And there was an arcade across the way, and the boys would go play in the arcade and then come to the restaurant and eat dinner. Also, when my husband died, it's funny, my grandmother was widowed at 45, my mother was widowed at 55, I was widowed at 59, and I'm wondering if there's something wrong with the women in this family. We're very hard on our husbands. Anyway, my mother was widowed at 55, and she learned to drive because Well, I had very young children then. I was 30, so Jimmy was a baby. And she knew that I couldn't take care of her, and she had to be independent, so she learned how to drive at 55, which was really good.
She didn't have a license before that.
Oh, God, no, she never drove before then. My father drove her everywhere. And then in the summers, my mother would spend summers with us at the shore. And I think it was very good for my children because they really got to know her. And memories of the three boys sitting on my mother's bed listening to baseball games because she liked baseball because of my brother.
What example did she set to you as a mother and parent?
Well, my mother was very nurturing, and I don't know if it's a trait you inherit or if it's a cultural thing, but our children were everything, and they were first and foremost. Everything was for the children and what was best for the children. She was very liberal and very understanding. She was not judgmental. She was a Christian. She was not extreme. She wasn't narrow-minded in any way. She was very good in not interfering with what my parenting, but she was crazy about my children. But she was such a good mother. She was very nurturing and very loving. When I was a teenager and I went to proms, my mother made gorgeous dresses for me. And when I got engaged, my mother went shopping because in those days, a young girl had a trousseau and she went out buying towels and nightgowns and negligees, and she had a ball. She loved my being engaged and planning a wedding for me and buying my wedding dress. It was a lot of fun. She was my best friend. My mother was really my closest friend for all of her life. I don't know if Lydia told you, but my mother was at church, Stella Maris in South Philadelphia. And these two women, I don't know what country they were from. They were Spanish. And they were upset. And I guess my mother started talking to them. And here they were in America because their brother was in a hospital here. Maybe it was a husband and a brother. And my mother took them in. She had them come stay with her, and she helped them. So she was very nurturing. She was very giving. She was religious. My mother and I went to church together every Sunday. My mother and I had orchestra tickets. We went to the concerts at, then it was the Academy of Music. My mother loved my father. My father was crazy about my mother, and they really had a beautiful marriage. My father was difficult, sometimes extremely annoying, but they were very happy together. There was no question about they really were happy together.
Do you feel that their strong marriage set a very high expectation in you for a spouse?
Oh, my husband said that. He said, you expect your marriage to be like your parents' marriage, but they've been married for a long time, my husband said. Because in the beginning, marriage is tough. My father met my mother through Bob Sebastian, who was dating my mother's sister, Beatrice. So I thought that was funny. And they played bridge. They loved to play bridge. New Year's Eve was 2 tables of bridge and dinner. I have very strong memories of that, of bridge. And my father wrote a bridge system. He also wrote poetry. He also had a wonderful tenor voice. And I'm hoping we can get something that we can play for the children of him singing.
So what was it like growing up under their roof?
Oh, life was very pleasant. My father was very generous. We had wonderful Christmases, and my memories of Christmas were fabulous, and I passed that on to my children, and I know my children are passing it on to their children. They were very giving. They were self-sacrificing. They were ideal parents, and they were very smart, and they stressed education and why education was important. No, my father did that. My father told my mother, let's go easy on Christmas. I'll give you money and we go shopping after Christmas, because he was very frugal. He said, it's crazy. It's so much cheaper to go after Christmas. And what happened was my mother bought everything for Christmas, and then my father gave us money, and we bought everything after Christmas. We made out that year.
shared that too.
My parents were very lucky in that they had parents who wanted them and loved them. I was very lucky, as was my husband, in that we had parents who wanted us and loved us. So I'm saying to my children, my grandchildren, be careful who you marry, because if you're boys, and 6 of you are, the girl you marry is going to raise your children. And you want to have a wife. Gosh, in this day and age, I guess it's really hard to find a woman who was happily married, had parents who were happily married, because it's hard. Being married is hard. And there are a lot of times when you'd like to just walk away, but it means everything if you can stay together for your children. And your children always have to come first. Because you change a child if you get divorced. The child totally changes. Plus, you teach a child how to be a husband or how to be a wife by the example you give. And people argue. Your marriage is never smooth. I mean, there are times when you just don't know how you stay together. But they have to learn that you have bad times, but then you come together and you work together and you make it work because of the children. And then, surprise, the children are gone, and then it's a really nice life. It's really nice to be married.
Well,
And you share your children, because nobody, the thing I miss about my husband is that nobody to share my children with.
in Dad's video, I want you to know that I acknowledge you about how difficult Dad was, and that you had a come to Jesus moment or make a decision. You had a Rubicon to cross that would have led to a different path to finish separate from him, and you chose to stay.
Yep.
But how did that turn out for you?
Oh, beautifully. It was. What kind of life would I have had alone? And the important thing is, nobody loves your children the way your mate does, that their father does. And you have that to share forever. And then grandchildren are unbelievable. My mother used to say, God gives you grandchildren as a reward for not killing your children. But see, the thing is too, Larry, I was wrong in that I tried to make him be who my father was. My father was he was a very different personality. And he and my mother had a very strong social life. They went to operas, they went to Europe, they played bridge, they had mutual friends. They had a very different life than I did. And I wanted that. And that's not who my husband was. So I had to learn to accept it. And I had to learn to realize if I'm going to stay with him, I've got to make life nice and I've got to make things pleasant. And I had to be more pleasant.
What would you say is the one thing that she taught you, or that you took from her?
Well, one of the main things is she taught me how to be a grandmother. She adored her grandchildren, and she made them each feel like they were special. And I think each of them felt that they were her favorite.
Mother, words to live by that you always told me from my grandfather.
He told me something that has been invaluable in my whole life, and that is that people like you if you make them feel good about yourself.
How did you apply that?
Everywhere, whether it's people you work with, whether it's teachers, whether it's children, adults, whatever.
Spouses.
Everybody you deal with, it matters.
Significant others and spouses?
Spouses, yeah, everything.